Pueblo art. Indian designs along the walls lead to the florid altar screen with the sun, the firmament and the moon on top painted in the Indian way, and the Blessed Trinity in Spanish style below them. On the right is St. Barbara, who protected you from thunder and gunshot wounds, a useful saint for Indians to have. In this fusion between European and Native American traditions, a rich aesthetic rises from cultural collision, and this would be very much part of the story of the arts in a nation made of immigrants. The priests secured the frontier. Then came Spanish settlers. They built their big, self-contained farmhouses or haciendas like fortresses to withstand attacks from hostile Indians. Made of adobe, most of these have perished, and this is one of the few that remain, Casa San Isidro. The early Spanish colonists led isolated and harsh lives in a culture of survival propped up by faith. Today, this is the home of Ward Alan Minge. What was this room?
This happens to be a chapel. I suppose it seems strange to us nowadays, but in the old Spanish homes, especially if we were large enough with a large family, they often had their own chapels such as this. It's very plain, actually, by those that you might find in Mexico or Spain, but it reflects, I think, the hard life that the settlers had here in New Mexico.
When the colonists, including the missionaries, were here, they were pretty much on their own, weren't they?
That's true, and the isolation is what many of us feel has resulted in a rather unique cultural expression that we find in this area.
The Franciscans encouraged images that were simple and direct, crudely carved, highly colored, full of sacrifice and death. You needed the impact to drive home religious doctrine. It reaches an extreme in a type of statue made by penitential cults in New Mexico known as Doña Sebastiana, death riding in a cart. This skull-headed crone wielding her bow and arrow is Eros reversed. These death carts are among the most powerful and unnerving sculptures produced in North America. The Spanish settlers brought to the New World the culture of the old. But there was a more radical idea to come: Americans as a new people for whom God had marked out a special role in human history. This came with another group, English Puritans, who landed on the cold coast of Massachusetts in the 17th century. The arrival of the Puritans was a truly mythic event. Mythic because it was meant to be. In the famous phrase of their leader, John Winthrop, they would build a city on a hill whose example would shine back across the Atlantic and reform the corrupt old world.
We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. We shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
Winthrop spoke those words in mid-Atlantic on board the ship Arbella. He believed his flock had been chosen by God to begin a new phase of human history, a renewal of the story of Exodus. These men, and women too, were biblical fundamentalists. They imagined their leaders as Moses, as Abraham, as elected saints. They were the first to call themselves Americans, and the society they created has proved absolutely basic to the way Americans imagine themselves today. New people and the beginnings of a new architecture. The four-square old ship Meetinghouse in Hingham could hold the whole community, 700 people. This is the oldest church in New England. It's also the last surviving Puritan meeting house. Its frame was raised by the people of Hingham in 3 days in the summer of 1681, and it opened for worship 6 months later. It came to be known as the Old Ship Meeting House. Why the name, nobody seems to know, except that people must have been reminded by the great structure of the roof with its massive timber beams of the inverted hull of a ship, an ark. There can't be many oaks left in Massachusetts today big enough to supply the timber for these huge king post trusses. This is very pure architecture, as befits its purpose. How long were the ceremonies here?
They'd be here for 6 hours on a Sunday, in 2 sittings on very hard benches without backs. One can see in the mind's eye the women with small children here on their laps, the older people in the front, all of them centered on the Word. That's what was happening here. They came before a pulpit that would often have an eye painted on the front of it, which was God's omniscient eye watching them.
And this would be the only decoration in the church?
This would be very nearly it. They stripped away everything else, the stained glass words, all of them gone. It's interesting to see the light in this building. I was struck when I was in Wells Cathedral in England, where the Puritans had smashed the stained glass windows, and white glass remained, and there was a kind of intensity of that light, which one sees here. I think they wanted to see things clearly and directly. They wanted no intermediaries. There was a kind of seriousness and urgency about all of this, and it's made America what it is today.
These Puritans delighted in radical bareness. They would not tolerate graven images of God or the saints. Some of them must have felt sorry that New England had no Catholic icons for them to smash. Yet the meeting house does have its aesthetic. It exists to frame the spoken word, to which the visual image must forever defer. Simple gravestones were their only religious art and their only sculpture. Puritan society was fixated on death to a degree that modern Americans can hardly imagine. Today, we sweep death under the carpet. Then, it held the foreground of social life. At funerals, whole villages would get drunk, and children were dragged snivelling to the edge of open graves to teach them that they too would die. The death's head on the stone reminded you that this world was only an anteroom to a real and eternal one, that its realities were insubstantial, its modest achievements all in vain. The Puritans were at least as superstitious as the Indians whose beliefs they scorned. In their world, nothing was accidental. Good was part of God's plan, evil was the result of diabolic conspiracy. They lived in a world of omens and portents. They were obsessed by witchcraft. This hysteria started in 1692 during the ministry of Parson Joseph Capon. His house still stands in the small village of Topsfield. He was one of the few to try and save those accused as agents of Satan in the famous Salem witchcraft trials. Parson Capon tried to remonstrate with the witch hunters at Salem, but he failed, and the women were all hanged. His house in Topsfield still stands, and it gives you, with these low ceilings and the heavy beams, a strong sense of the kind of world that these people were constructing for themselves, intimate and close-knit, and designed to keep the family in and the wilderness out. Built in 1683, the Parson Capon House is probably the best surviving example of Jacobean architecture in America. Its brick chimney was a sign of affluence for the times. The door is double thickness, clinched with nails against Indian attack, and this hanging finial was one of the few ornamental touches. The Puritans didn't invent a severe domestic style to reflect a severe ideology. Many 17th century English houses looked like this. But in other parts of that